Well, good morning. It is fantastic to be here with y'all this morning, and I would like to invite y'all into a conversation this morning. I've had a similar conversation about 12 different times with 12 different people in the last 3 or 4 months. I am not an expert in culture by any means. I'm kind of just a guy, but I can notice a pattern when I see one, and I've had a conversation with these dozen or so folks. They fit the same demographic. They've been a Christian for a number of decades. They've lived in this culture in the Pacific Northwest for quite a while. And they feel this apathy from the world around them. And the question that they've been asking is, what does my faith have to give my neighbors? Like, what do I have to give the people around me? As I look at my neighbors, they seem happy. Their lives are full. They're moderately successful. They don't feel like they have any need for God, and I don't know how to enter into that. And so if you're here this morning and you feel the apathy of the culture around you, you don't know what your faith has to offer your neighbor, and you want to enter the uncertainty that you feel, this sermon is for you. Now, that's a rather specific group of people I'm talking to, and so if you're here this morning and you're not a Christian, my hope for you is that hopefully this sermon will help you understand why sometimes Christians act kind of weird. Using the text of Daniel chapter 1, what I would like to do is I would like to take Daniel 1 and I'd like to lay it over the top of the culture that we have here in the Pacific Northwest and take a look at some similarities and see some differences and just engage with this story a little bit. And I want to enter this uncertainty that you might be feeling. And I want to say that I think it might have something to do with the type story that we're in and understanding what kind of story are we in. So in the first half of the sermon, I'd like to ask the question, what kind of story are we in? What kind of story is Daniel chapter 1? And how might that inform what kind of story we're living in here? And then in the second half of the sermon, I'd like to look at how do we say yes and how do we say no? And we'll take a look at a few examples along the way. Again, with the goal of helping the Christian into the uncertainty that they might be feeling when they are feeling the apathy of their neighbors and they're asking the question, what does my faith have to give my neighbors? Emma, if you would please read Daniel chapter 1, and let's stop at verse 16.
Alrighty then. You can follow along in page 716 in the Pew Bibles if you want. In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord delivered Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, along with some of the articles from the temple of God. These he carried off to the temple of his God in Babylonia, and put in the treasure house of his God. Then the king ordered Ashpenaz, chief of his court officials, to bring into the king's service some of the Israelites from the royal family and the nobility, young men without any physical defect, handsome, showing aptitude for every kind of learning, well-informed, quick to understand, and qualified to serve in the king's palace. He was to teach them the language and literature of the Babylonians. The king assigned them a daily amount of food and wine from the king's table. They were to be trained for 3 years, and after that they were to enter the king's service. Among those who were chosen were some from Judah: Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. The chief official gave them new names. To Daniel, the name Belshazzar; to Hananiah, Shadrach; to Mishael, Meshach; and to Azariah, Abednego. But Daniel resolved not to defile himself with the royal food and wine, and he asked the chief official for permission not to defile himself this way. Now God had caused the official to show favor and compassion to Daniel. But the official told Daniel, "I am afraid of my lord the king, who has assigned your food and drink. Why should he see you looking worse than the other young men your age? The king would then have my head because of you." Daniel then said to the guard, whom the chief official had appointed over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, "Please test your servants for 10 days. Give us nothing but vegetables to eat and water to drink. Then compare our appearance with that of the young men who eat the royal food, and treat your servants in accordance with what you see." So he agreed to this and tested them for 10 days. At the end of the 10 days, they looked healthier and better nourished than any of the young men who ate the royal food. So the guard took away their choice food and the wine they were to drink and gave them vegetables instead. This is the word of the Lord.
Thank you. So what kind of story are we in? To give you a bit of background, Daniel and his friends lived in Jerusalem, and the Babylonian army comes to Jerusalem. They lay siege to Jerusalem. They destroy Jerusalem. They kill almost everybody there. They deport everyone that's left over back to Babylon, and they force the best and the brightest to serve King Nebuchadnezzar. This sort of thing happened all the time back then. Thanks to archaeology, we've able to find that this story exists in all the cultures. There's all these city-states back then, and they're constantly at war with one another. They're constantly conquering each other, and every time they conquer somebody else, they do the same thing. They kill almost everyone, they deport whoever's left over, and they make the best and the brightest serve in the court of the foreign king. So Assyrians have stories of Assyrians being conquered and being forced to work in the court of a foreign king. Egyptians have stories of Egyptians being conquered and being forced to work in the foreign king. Babylonians have stories like this. Phoenicians have stories like this. Sumerians. It was a thing. It's kind of what happened back then. And as we lay out all of these stories from these different cultures in this time period, they fit pretty cleanly into two different kinds of stories. The first one is a conflict story. That's the first type of story. In a conflict story, the theme is, I'd rather die than become like you. That's the message of the story. We have that in Daniel chapter 2, where Meshach, Shadrach, and Abednego are told to worship the king as a god, and they say no, and they get tossed into a fiery furnace, and we get to see what happens. A couple of chapters later, Daniel is told to worship an idol as God. He says no. He gets tossed into a den of lions, and we get to see what happens. These sorts of stories have been used throughout time to help comfort people when they're in a situation where their way of life is under attack and people are trying to kill them. And we worship God alone. We are people who worship only God. These stories are fantastic for helping reinforce we worship only God. In Daniel, the book of Daniel, the main theme is that despite the present circumstances, God is in control of everything. That's a really comforting theme for the people in Daniel's time, and that's a really comforting theme for me as well. But as I read these conflict stories, well, here's what happened. Most of the training that I got as a young man in evangelism, in discipleship, in how to relate to the world around me was rooted in the conflict kind of story. We like the conflict stories. The culture is under attack, the culture is attacking us. The church is under attack. We're being assaulted by the people around us. We have to stand firm in the faith. We have to boldly proclaim the name of Jesus and risk losing everything. We like the chest-thumping conflict stories. This morning, we sang Onward Christian Soldiers during the hymn sing. And that's the thing we like. But a weird thing happened. See, I started actually making friends with people who weren't Christian, and I discovered that most of them didn't feel attacked by the church. Most of them didn't feel threatened by the church, and they certainly didn't feel like they were attacking the church. They really didn't feel much of anything towards the church. And I found that me bringing this energy of conflict to the relationship, it wasn't real helpful for me in getting to know them and them getting to know me. It was a weird way to engage with what was going on. And what they were doing instead was they were making a comparison. They were looking at the life that was offered to them from the church, and they were looking at the life that was offered to them from other sources. And on balance, they were just leaving because They didn't see any water down that well. There wasn't anything worth pursuing. As they compared these two things, they just left because they weren't interested in this. And that's the second type of story that we have in literature from this era, from Daniel's time. The first one is a conflict, but the second one is a comparison story. And the theme in a comparison story is, well, because of my faith, I do things this way. And it doesn't draw a hard line in the sand. Rather, it shows the person who's been conquered saying that, well, because I love God this sort of way and I live in this sort of way, I do this. And he invites the other people around him to check it out. We'll see Joseph do this in the book of Genesis when he's pressed to work in the court of Pharaoh and he starts interpreting dreams. We'll also see Daniel do this in interpreting dreams later on. And we see Daniel do this here in chapter 1. When Daniel is responding in this situation, there's no threats. Instead, Daniel almost responds in kindness. And so if I'm not doing this evangelism through a conflict grid, if I'm not sharing my faith through this mindset of conflict, how do I live in this comparison story? As I was preparing for this sermon, I asked about a half a dozen friends of mine who aren't Christian just what their take on the church was. And I asked them if they felt like Christianity was the dominant religion in this area, and they said no. And I asked them if they felt threatened by the church, and they said no. And I asked them if they felt oppressed by the church, and they said no. And I asked them if they felt like the church was being oppressed, and they said no. And I asked them if they thought about anything about the church. And they said no. And again, one of them said, well, I look at what I see from coming out of churches, and I look at other things, and I'm going this way. So if we're in this comparison story, people are comparing what the church is offering to what they have, what do we say yes to in a comparison story? And saying yes is one of the things I really love about Presbyterianism. Being Presbyterian affirms a high view of engaging with culture, engaging the world around us. There's a lot we can say yes to. And stories like Daniel help influence that view of, hey, there's a lot we can say yes to. Let's take a look at verses 3 to 7. Daniel and his friends say yes to entering the training of the king. That's a big deal. Daniel and his friends say yes to having their names changed. That's a huge part of their identity, and they don't resist that. Daniel and his friends say yes to entering the service of the king who had killed 90% of everyone they had ever known. Nebuchadnezzar had killed almost everyone they had ever known, and Daniel and his friends serve that king and start working to make Babylonian life better. That's amazing. Now, today, probably nobody is trying to kill you for your faith. Probably nobody is oppressing you for your faith. I mean, there might be exceptions. If you work in the academy, you might get passed over for a job if you're a Christian. There could be little pockets where there's things like that. But most Christians, most of the time, can do most things without having their faith be a source of tension, an obstacle of oppression, something that's going to make life a lot harder for you. And if you feel like you are living in one of those exception sort of things, I invite you to share your experience with your Jewish friend. I invite you to share your experience with your Muslim friend, with your Sikh friend, and just see if what you're experiencing from culture is drastically different from what they are. I guess what I'm trying to say with this is that disinterest is not the same thing as persecution in Daniel's time, and it's not the same thing in America either. So what do I have to give my neighbor if my neighbor's not trying to kill me? And I'm not going to try to conquer my neighbor. Well, if I invite my friends into my heart, they'll discover that Jesus is there. God is in my heart. God lives within me. And the more that I invite someone else into my heart, into my life, well, they'll see that Jesus is there. If you're old enough to remember friendship evangelism from a couple of decades ago, this is not that. That used friendship as a weapon of assault as well, of conquering the other as well. This isn't like friendship evangelism. This is actual friendship. Just friendship. Because if I'm the one to be vulnerable first with others and talk about something besides the weather or sports or which 5K fundraiser I'm participating in next, then I can invite someone into my heart, and as they come there, they'll find Jesus is there. That's what we can say yes to. But Daniel didn't say yes to everything. There was something that Daniel said no to. If I like how Presbyterians are good at saying yes, I feel like saying no could be a growth area for the church. But there are some things we say no to. In verse 8, Daniel says no to the food and the wine. Why? We don't know. Some people believe it's because the food wasn't kosher. Daniel was living in a foreign country. Kosher's a whole different thing now, and the story doesn't say anything about the kosher food laws, so I don't find that argument compelling. Some people think it's because the food and the wine would have been dedicated to idols. So were the vegetables that they were eating. Everything in the Babylonian food system was part of the Babylonian religious system. They weren't separated. So I don't find that argument compelling. The story seems to want to keep us in the dark on why they said no. And so I'm left with this conclusion, and I put it on a slide, that Daniel and his friends were free to say yes to the food and the wine. They used their freedom to say no because it would disrupt their relationship with God. And they said no in a way that helped people compare their Jewish faith to the Babylonian faith. That's what they did by saying no. So let's fast forward it to our time, and we'll have a very hyper-specific example. What is something that I am free to say yes to, but I use my freedom to say no because it would disrupt my relationship with God, and I say no in a way that helps people compare my faith to whatever they believe? As a new preacher, oftentimes the problem is things are too vague. The pendulum might have swung a little bit too far the other direction with this one. This is a rather specific example. And it took me a long time of sitting and praying and thinking through this. And then when the example came, I was able to look back at the last 7 years that I've lived here, and I'd seen this event happen over and over and over again. Let me tell you what happened most recently. A few weeks ago, my family was at a dinner party with some friends. There was about 5 families that were there. We're all eating together. And we started talking about life and faith and politics. They heard I was a Christian. I'm comfortable talking about my faith. In a group like that, we were chatting. And one guy sitting across from me, he's got this axe to grind. And he starts firing away these questions. Things like, so what do you think about homosexuality? What do you think about sex outside of marriage? What do you think about alcohol? What do you think about drugs? Who are you voting for in the presidential election? What do you think about gun control? How would you solve the violence crisis? I mean, just hammering away, kind of at about that pace. And so I could tell these questions, it's not the thing driving the bus, right? There's something else sitting in the driver's seat. So I'm trying to ask some questions just to figure out where is this coming from. And then this woman sitting next to me here says, okay, so for you, the Bible is your moral guide. That's your moral compass. And I said, no. See, now here's the comparison. The comparison is between a moral guide or a moral compass and loving Jesus, okay? That's the comparison that I have found is helpful in this culture. So I tell her, no, the Bible is not a moral guide. The Bible, I don't follow these rules because it's my moral guide. I follow them because I love God. I follow them because I love Jesus. I want to grow deeper in love with Jesus, and I want to pursue a relationship with a living God. And In fact, when we read the stories of when Jesus was on earth, pursuing a moral vision without loving God, that was like the thing he was on about. That was his axe to grind, and he did it over and over again on these folks called Pharisees because they wanted the moral vision, but they didn't love God. And as I say that, the guy sitting here, he softens, and he goes, oh, I've never thought of it like that. I've just seen you Christians go and do the craziest things, and it never made sense to me. And I said, well, sure, if you don't believe in God, it's hard to appreciate that we're doing this not out of some moral compulsion, but because we actually love God. To make another analogy, there are rules to my marriage. There is a moral grid to my marriage, but I didn't marry Denise because I love the moral grid. And the grid doesn't exist. Like, that's not the focus. I want to love her, and these things help me love her. Now, am I free to call the Bible a moral compass? Sure. Am I free to call my religious faith a moral guide? Yep. But I don't, ever, in this culture, because it helps invite people into, this is why I live my life the way I do. So, in conclusion, if you are feeling the uncertainty in the culture around you and you want to enter into this uncertainty, what do you do next? I now get to give you my favorite answer as a visiting preacher. I don't know. I have no idea what God is calling you to do. I just know there's some great people around here that you can lean into that conversation with. Maybe you want to get some people that live in your neighborhood together and pray and lean into this. Or maybe whatever community God has you a part of, that there's a chance for you with some people here to enter into this. One thing I do know is that the Holy Spirit is already talking to those around you, and we're all invited to participate in that conversation. Would you pray with me, please? God, thank you for the gift of your word, that you love us, and that these stories are there to help us grow deeper in love with you. I pray that your Spirit, as it speaks to the neighbors around us, that your Spirit would speak to us as well, and that it would guide us, and that any uncertainty that any of us might feel might be a spark to help us lean closer into you and closer into those around us. We love you, God. Amen.